Hello, everyone, and welcome to Generate Call Symposium. It is my great pleasure to introduce our first keynote, Maria Camino Bueno Alusei. She holds a PhD in English philology from the University of the Basque Country and is associate professor in the area of applied linguistics at the Public University of Navarra. After teaching English for specific purposes in a variety of degrees, nursing, agricultural engineering, computer sciences, she currently teaches ICT applied to the teaching of foreign languages both in the BA degree in primary and early childhood teacher education and in the Masters of Secondary Education teacher training. Her research activity has focused on the study of ICT, mainly on the development of oral and written skills, CLIL, and many others. She has led numerous research projects and published in index journals. We're very happy to have you here today, Camino. You're going to give us some insights into qualitative teaching. And after the theoretical remarks, we'll have a few minutes for questions. So if you want to start sharing your screen, whenever you're ready, Camino, the floor is yours. And thank you very much for being here today with us.
Okay, thank you, Anna, and thank you for the introduction. Okay, so let me see if I can, yes. Okay, can you see that? Can you see the presentation? Yes? Yes, Anna? Okay, fine. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about qualitative research. This is just a brief introduction, and I'm going to focus on more or less what I understand qualitative research can do for studying the analysis of interactions or of some in our case, virtual exchanges, but it can be applied to any intervention that you do in a class, let's say. Okay, so the first thing, this is what I'm going to be talking about. Then first, I'm going to be talking about why we do qualitative research. Then I'm going to be talking about the design of qualitative research. I'm going to talk about the records, the data records, then about the type of data that you need to use so that we analyze, the procedure, how we do it, very briefly, really. And then I'm going to be talking about the kind of studies that can be done using qualitative research. Then I'm going to be talking a little bit about the analysis of qualitative data, especially about the types of analysis, the coding, the reliability. And then finally, I'm going to be talking about how to report a qualitative analysis, let's say, to complement generally others. So first thing, so why do we use a qualitative research, or what is the objective of qualitative research? Number one, it is used when it is not possible to illustrate what's happening by using just quantitative data. In general, we use qualitative data to complement or to explain further quantitative data, or at least the majority of the studies today are using qualitative data for that purpose in general. There are not many qualitative studies just on their own, and especially when you are studying interventions like classroom interventions. Today, the most common qualitative research is included into a mixed methods design where we include both types of data. Then why are we using qualitative data? We're using it to better represent what's happening. Because generally, when we are just using in case studies, because generally what we do is analyze like many specific case studies, and we analyze what's happening there. we need a better representation of reality, let's say. And reality is usually complex. That means that we need deeper insights into each of the phenomena which we are trying to explain. For that, those deeper insights, and to identify reasons or to explain behaviors, we need to use qualitative data and to analyze those data. So let's go to the design. Once we have decided we need that to represent reality and to represent normally the complex situation, the complex context in every intervention, we need to design something. Okay, we need to design the kind of research we want to do. The first thing we need to do is to think about the purpose. That is why we are doing that research. Why do we want to obtain from that research? Why we think it is interesting to offer more data, more explanations, more illustrations of what is happening there. So that should be the purpose, that is the why. And then we also need to establish the goal of the intervention. And the goal is the question we are going to answer with that, with all those data that we have. So, for example, if I am going to analyze two programs or two software programs to analyze qualitative data, my purpose is going to be why am I analyzing that? I want to analyze those programs to see which one I'm going to use for this research, for example. My goal would be to answer the question of which of those two programs is better for my analysis. So they are like quite similar, the purpose and the goal, but they are not exactly the same. Normally, the purpose is sort of broader, while the question tends to be more specific. And that is the way it should be. Questions should be more specific. So once we have decided that, we need to decide on the design. To be able to answer that question, I can use different kinds of design. And the most common ones, as I told you already, are like three, okay? All of them are mixed methods designs. And the first one is to use quantitative data first, to analyze those data, and then to analyze qualitative data, like in the second stage. It can be collecting those data after collecting the quantitative data, or you can collect both of those data at the same time, but you analyze one after the other. And that will be a quantitative qualitative design. Or we can do just the contrary. That is what we can do, qualitative and then quantitative. For example, we can use interviews, and we can interview maybe 5 people from a class and ask them some questions about what they have found to be the most useful thing or the least useful thing. And then from their answers, we can design a questionnaire and then ask 5 groups of students to see whether they agree on what the others have said or not. And in that case, we will have a qualitative, quantitative design. So first we get data which are more complex, let's say. From that we extract benefits, challenges, more useful, less useful, etc. And then we get quantitative data, which is not that clear because the quantitative data can also be, for example, Likert scales, in which we are only going to get quantities, like how many people or degree or something. which could also be qualitative. Okay, so it's a bit complex in that way. But in that case, the quantitative is going to give me quantities of people, how many people think that, etc. And we can also have qualitative, quantitative, qualitative, or the other way around, qualitative, quantitative, quantitative, qualitative, and then a second quantitative one, okay? Those are the four designs. I didn't want to repeat the other one, okay, but those are the most common ones. Then you can also have others, but I think with those, you can cover nearly everything, okay? Then next thing you have to think about is the types of research you are going to do. That is, which kind of research am I going to do? The first thing you have to think is about what, which type of qualitative research do I want to do? I mean, I'm going to talk only about the qualitative part of those designs, okay? So we can have phenomenology, which is the study of just one phenomenon in different context or just in one context. We can also have case studies, and we can also have action research. Those are like the three most common ones as far as like language teaching is concerned. Then we can also have others like narrative research, ethnography, or grounded theory, but that's not very common for linguistics, let's say, okay? So the ones we use are those three kinds. And then we need to also decide on the methods. How are we going to analyze data? That is more the methods. And generally, what we use is content analysis. That is when we analyze the content of whatever qualitative instrument we have used, okay? And we just analyze the content in general. Another kind is thematic analysis, which is what the majority of people use. That is, we group all the data into themes or categories to try to explain something. And then we can also have discourse analysis. And discourse analysis is and that should be singular, and I don't know why I wrote the plural, but never mind. Okay, so that is, discourse analysis is when we analyze what people are saying, and we analyze that within the context where that is being said. So it is different in the sense that content analysis is just generally about the content of what people is saying. Thematic analysis is just categorizing sort of everything people are saying into specific categories or themes. So we are looking for common themes to reduce data. And discourse analysis, which is like to try to explain that into a context, try to give meaning to discourse, which is different. Okay, those are the three types that are most commonly used in linguistics. Okay, then second part of design is to decide the type of data we are going to analyze and we are going to collect. Now, I have divided, and this is a personal, I mean, this is something I have like categorized, but it's not sort of official, okay? So that I categorize the data into two main groups. The first one is direct data, and that is, for example, interviews or focus groups, reflection essays, observations, diaries, or justification or something, like you ask students to justify why they have done something or why they enjoy something. And why do I call that direct? Because they, in all, when you use all those instruments, you are directly observing whatever you want to analyze, and students are directly talking or thinking or writing about whatever you want to analyze. That is, for example, in our case, if you want them to analyze virtual exchanges, you in the interview you ask directly about the virtual exchange. That is, you talk about why, what did you think about that? Did you enjoy it? Didn't you enjoy it? Whatever. The same about reflection essays. You tell them to reflect on generally on some predefined questions, or you tell them reflect on the process or what you've done, how you have changed, whatever. The same with observations, like you observe what they are doing and then you tick things. The same with diaries or justifications. Okay, so they are the instruments, and you get direct data, which is directly explanatory, let's call it, this talking about whatever you want to analyze. Then another kind of data you can have is indirect data. And for me, that is, for example, interactions, lesson plans, for example, or surveys. Why are they indirect? Because students are not talking about what you want to observe. Students are doing something else, and you are observing what in those things, what they are saying or what they are mentioning about whatever you want to see. But it's not directly related to the phenomena, let's call, you are observing. That is, for example, like if you tell them, do you control yourself in a Likert scale? Explain why or why not. And they explain, oh, I don't really think I control myself because I get very annoyed about ba, 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 ba. But you are trying to see whether their capacity to control themselves has increased while doing the virtual exchange because of the problems he has had. You are not asking him how the virtual exchange has affected that. He's talking about his capacity in general. And from that, you are extracting that he is able to control himself more because of his participation in that virtual exchange. That's why I call that indirect data. Okay, because you take data from something they are doing to explain something else or to justify something else or to analyze the behavior produced by something else, but not straight away have them talking about that, about whatever you want to analyze. Okay, so those are the instruments you can use for getting qualitative data. Okay. Then the procedure. So what do we do when we, in the design of the intervention, you need to sort of think of the procedure of what you're going to do. And from experience, my recommendation is that the first thing you need to do is to plan how you're going to collect the data and when you're going to collect the data. You cannot think about that as the intervention or the experiment is going on. You need to think about that beforehand. Okay, so you need beforehand to consider, okay, how am I going to collect the data? Am I going to collect this before that, after that, or whatever? So for a good intervention, you need to plan on how you're going to do that. Then the second thing you need to consider is that you need some sort of triangulation. That is, you need to consider how you're going to collect different kinds of data about the same thing so that you can analyze different things and see whether you get the same results from all of those things. Okay, and I will talk about that later regarding validity, the validity of the data or the analysis, let's call it. Okay, then you need to select from the data which is probably the most difficult part. The most difficult part is to select what you're going to analyze, because generally you have too many data, that is, you have too many things to analyze, and it's quite a daunting like task to decide what and how much you're going to analyze. So that is something which is quite important, to select from the data which parts you're going to analyze first, which parts you're going to analyze second, how much is enough. That is something else. Okay, and then once you have made the selection, then you need to do the coding. The coding, generally what I've done, this is what I have always done, and I don't know whether, and I think it's been successful, and that is what literature says that you need to do, which is if you going to code data, not alone, which is not very it's not recommended to analyze data alone. You need to do it with more people. Is to do an initial coding of more or less a 10% of the data which you have, and you need to reach something above an 85% of agreement among coders. And after doing that initial common coding, which can take quite a while, like in the last research we've done, we did 5 rounds of initial coding. That is, we did an initial coding in which we coded like 5% more or less of the data we had. Then we had a meeting, we discussed everything we've done, doubts, new codes, etc. And then we got, or we divided, we selected like another 5%, another 3%, I don't really remember. We coded the initial 5% and the other 3% again. Then we decided we didn't reach like a high enough agreement among the raters, and then we decided to code another 2% and another until we reach a 93% agreement. Once we reached that 93% agreement, we divided the rest of the data among all the coders, and then everybody else coded only the part that was like given to them. And generally, you need to do the individual coding should be about an 85% to 90% of the data that could be individually coded once you have reached the previous agreement. And then after you've done that, you have to do an interpretation of what of everything you have coded. That is, you have to collide everything everybody has coded, and with that, once you collide all those data and you have all the results, then you need to get together again, interpret what you've got, and then report or tell the story of the data which you've got. Okay, so this is everything about design. And now I'm going to talk about how to analyze data. Okay, so now we have already decided on the design. We have designed or decide on which instruments we're going to use. We have done everything. We have implemented those instruments. So we have all the data which we need. And then we are going to start with the analysis of the data which we have. So this goes for that initial coding, okay, which we're going to go to do together. So ways to analyze qualitative data, basically there are two ways. One is a general one in which you're looking for themes or patterns not predefined. That is, you are going through the data and see what happens. Okay, so which can also be done. That is, we get maybe 5 reflections or maybe 20 answers to some of the open-ended questions in our surveys. And then we decide to see what's there and to see what we're interested in or what we think is going to illustrate whatever we're doing. Consider that we already have a goal, that is, we have a question, so we cannot be interested in anything, but has to be something related to the question, which we have like formulated at the beginning of our research project. And that is one way of doing it, general. Another way of doing it is to be specific. That is to have some initial themes and to add new themes once we have started analyzing the data. That is another way of doing it. Then we have different types of coding, which basically reflect these two ways to analyze the data. The first one I'm going to talk about, the types of coding, is retention or reduction. That is, retention goes more with that general way to analyze the data. And retention, I mean, you have some things people have said, some transcriptions or some whatever, and then you are trying to illustrate and to understand how something is working. So you select very specific examples of that, and you go through the data selecting just those examples or those quotations which you think are illustrating whatever you pretend to explain. Reduction means you establish some codes and you go through the data with those codes to try to reduce all the data and to sort of group all the data into certain things. So you are reducing everything to just the themes or the topics or the categories you want to analyze. Then you can also have inductive or deductive data types of coding, data coding. Inductive means you go through the data. It's the same as the first one. You go through data and then you decide which categories you're going to use after going through the data, normally by identifying themes or something like that. Deductive means you already have the themes. That is, you have already imagined, you have done literature research and you have found out that there are 20 studies that have identified 3 ways in which students use software to learn vocabulary. So you are going to analyze how students talk about their learning of vocabulary using software. So you use the categories those 20 studies have already used, and you analyze the students' accounts, the students' diaries with those categories. That is deductive. Using one or the other doesn't mean you have to use it all the time. That means it doesn't, using a mainly inductive coding means you're going to basically in general use more inductive than deductive. Using deductive doesn't mean you're not going to increase the number of codes you have initially. That is, sometimes you establish some codes at the very beginning, some categories, some nodes, and you find out afterwards that there are more. So you can add more. Okay, so it's not, one doesn't really eliminate the other, okay? But it's just like two different ways of doing it. Then you can also have a qualitative type of coding and a quantitative type of coding. And this is probably the most sort of contradictory thing, okay? To analyze qualitative data with quantitative measures, let's say. But it's very common, really. And I really recommend doing it, okay? Qualitative means you're just analyzing like statements, sort of ideas, okay? Whatever. Quantitative means you code things like, for example, you will say, this is an episode of vocabulary, okay? So two students have a breakdown of communication over vocabulary. So you say breakdown, vocabulary breakdown. So you do not analyze exactly what's happening in that episode, exactly what they are saying, but you just identify that with breakdown vocabulary, okay? And in that case, at the very end, what you do, you go through all the data and you identify all the breakdowns, all communication breakdowns and the cause of those communication breakdowns, and you do it quantitatively, even though the data are qualitative because it's the interaction. So you generally count how many instances of something have you found there, okay? And in that case, that is more a quantitative type of coding because you just code things which you can count afterwards. Okay, then there are like three sort of general types of coding. The first one is descriptive, and this is sort of an overarching category. For example, descriptive will be L1 of students, class of the students, I don't know, a semester in which students have done the virtual exchange. That will be just a descriptive coding, okay, which you have there. Topic. Topic can be, for example, perceptions of students. That is a very general topic. And then the analytical coding, which will be kind of perceptions, is more or less the same as nodes, categories, okay, or nodes, themes, which you can find in software programs that analyze qualitative data. Okay, that falls or that represents much better what you do there in the qualitative software program or the software program to analyze qualitative data. Okay, and then you can also have main categories and subcategories. Okay, so those are more or less the types of coding which you can do. And I wanted to tell you about all those kinds of coding because they are like complementary, and you need to know a little bit the possibilities which you have, okay? Which doesn't mean that you're going to use all of them, but at least if you know them, you can select the ones that you consider best fit the research or the piece of research you want to do. Okay, and then handling ideas. How do you handle the ideas which you get from the data? Okay, so the first thing you can do is to quantify and group ideas. That is one way of doing it. And that goes more with a deductive kind of coding, quantitative, and more into the sort of themes or thematic analysis. You quantify and you group all the themes so you can tell us how many people are mentioning that. And that is that is the way, at least most of the research I am reviewing, and most of the research that is being published corresponds to that, to quantifying and grouping ideas, even if you give examples of how you've done it. Okay, another another way of doing it is by explaining the categories and the relations among the different categories. Okay, so maybe you want to explain how how a context influences how students are perceiving the virtual exchange. For example, you can say, if you when we are analyzing the perceptions of Spanish students, we can see that all of them do all these things, while when they are Americans or they are from Turkey, for example, they do different things. Okay, so that is another way of organizing the categories and the relations. And then another way is to find patterns, which is more or less what I told you also, which is to talk about the similarities in the data, to talk about the differences in the data, to talk about gender, for example, class, nationality, language, L1, L2, etc. Okay? And then finally, what we need to do, and this is probably the most important part, is to code, to recode, and to post code. And by that, I mean, you need to do good coding. You need to recode the data once you have decided on the categories, or you have agreed on what each code represents. Let's call it like that. And then you need to do post coding. That is, you need to see whether the categories fit what you wanted to analyze, and whether you need to introduce new categories, new themes, or whatever afterwards. And then you need to code everything again to represent, or to have everything you've done. Okay, and then important things when analyzing. First thing, reliability. Okay, and by reliability, we mean consistency, basically. That means a code needs to represent the same thing in all the data by anybody who is analyzing those data. That means if we see a reflection essay, let's call, and I analyze it and somebody else analyzes it, we need to make sure the coding we are doing is nearly the same. It's never going to be the same, because with qualitative data, what we have is that there is a subjectivity, which is always going to be there, okay? But at least we need that to be as similar as possible. How do we do that? Well, as I have already stated several times, I think, common coding and recoding, okay, among colleagues and over time. It's quite good, like, to recode some parts together, maybe after 1 or 2 months, because sometimes you're coding and you are diverting from the common codes you have established a month earlier, because there are many things happening in the middle and you are seeing many things new. And sometimes you decide that I coded, or that something you coded at the beginning, you are not coding that in the same way and you don't realize it. Okay, so it's quite I will tell people to get together again after maybe 1 month and code just like a little thing together again, to see whether they are still coding in the same way or not. Okay, to check that that nobody is doing something different. Okay, as I said, 10% of the data initially and all the time needs to be coded like among everybody who is going to code. Okay. Then you need to do a recoding as many new pieces as needed, really, of anything. You need to have group discussions to agree on exactly what constitutes, or to give good examples. And normally it's not enough to have one example. You will need to have at least 5 or 6 examples of nearly everything so that you know exactly what you need to code as that. And then also it's very useful to discuss with the others every doubt you have. That is, if you find something which doesn't fit into whatever coding you're doing, it's quite useful to write to everybody and to say, look, I found that. I think that is interesting. I think that should go with that. What do you think? So that everybody can say, okay, yes, I think that goes with that, or that goes somewhere else, or that doesn't really fit that. Okay, that's quite useful. Then you need to revise all the categories, and you need to revise them quite often so that you can include new things or you can eliminate things. Sometimes you think there are going to be things which are there and they are not there, okay? And you don't find instances of that, or maybe you find one or two, and then you decide it's not useful. Okay, coding traps. The first coding trap is too many codes. That is to code everything and at the end to have so many codes. And this is very easy nowadays. I mean, before, people used to code like by hand. So they had to keep records of what they had. So if they had too many codes, it was too much. So they eliminated codes. Now, you have a computer program and you can include there as many codes as you want, okay? But sometimes to have too many codes ends up being very, very confusing. So, and it's not that reliable, okay? Now, the second trap is not to have enough codes, okay? That means you need a balance between too many and not enough, because you need as many codes as possible to interpret or to be able to show what you've got. And then if you do not have enough, you end up including things into some codes which should not be included there. So that is another danger which you have there. Okay, and then another of the traps which I have had is to reduce the data to fit the software program. Like sometimes, you have the software program and you need to fit that there, and sometimes it doesn't really. So if some of the categories do not fit there, or we need another way of accounting for those categories, that should be done, even if the computer program does it in a different way. So probably you need to find ways of doing it, even if the computer program does not allow you to do it the way you want to do it, okay? So that is also useful. Okay, then a coding book. You need a coding book, and more important than the coding book, I will say, is to record everything you've done. All the changes, everything that has been included, when it has been included, why it has been included, why you have modified things. Okay, so you need to keep a record or a diary or whatever of things which you have done, because it's very easy to forget. And if you do not have it written down somewhere, you are going to forget. And then when you have to write the methodology part of your paper, you are not going to remember how you did it and in what order. So it's very, very important in the coding book to include when things have been included, how they have been included, and why they have been included, and to have it there. Then you need to have a description, and you have to have examples of each code. And as I said, examples, not one example of each code, but examples of each code. And it needs to be plural. You need to have at least 4 or 5 examples of each of the things. Otherwise, it's very complicated. It makes things much more complicated than they should be, really. Okay, and then finally, it's quite useful to have trees or tables in the sense of to have a visual support of the categories, of the order of the categories, which one groups things which are below. So that's also quite useful. Okay, and then the next thing I want to talk about is about accounting and validating data. I only have 2 things here. First one is validity. That is, how do you make sure that your codes or your analysis more is valid? By triangulation, that means by getting the same kind of data from different sources so that you can check whether the same is happening everywhere, or maybe you are diverting for whatever. Also, checking the log for coding. That means you need to check what you've done or why you ended up where you are, okay, for the validity, especially to explain the validity of what you've done afterwards, which is very, very important if you want to publish, which at the end is what everybody wants to do. I mean, mainly you do qualitative research, quantitative research, any kind of research to publish and to report what you found out. And also you can do member checking, but that's not that common, okay? Member checking means you can get somebody, it's like a recall, okay? That is to get somebody who has done, who has filled in any of the instruments you've been using, and to tell that person to revise the coding you've done to see whether you were correct or you were not correct by when doing the analysis. But that's not very common nowadays. It used to be common, but now it's not. Then reliability is the second thing. I mean, those are the 2 things, validity and reliability, which you will need to explain when you write a qualitative paper, and which are the most difficult to explain in a qualitative paper, really. Okay, the first thing is consistency. And how do you explain consistency of the coding, the analysis you've made? By using inter-rater reliability, which is what I have told you already about quantity of data, about how much agreement, etc., which is needed, and which that's what research on qualitative data analysis has like established as the numbers you need to fill for that to be reliable. Okay, and then finally, how do you report qualitative data? Now, you've done all the analysis, you have the coding, it's like whatever. There are 2 ways of doing it. The first one is to synthesize whatever you have found out, and you can do it in 4 ways. The first one is the big picture. That is, you can talk about the big picture of anything you have analyzed. That is talking about the essential features, characteristics, essential things you have found out to explain the situation. Second one is the pathway. That is to talk about steps taken. That is how that has progressed and has ended up as it was. Then you also can have the X-ray view. That is you are going to explain a behavior by explaining everything around that behavior. Normally a cause effect. That is when you have that, the effect is that. And then finally, music and not the dance. And I haven't made up all those titles. They are from a book that if you have the opportunity, I'm showing it to you, Handling Qualitative Data by Lynn Richards, which I think is a very good book, like if you want to know more about all this. And then she calls it the music, not the dance, and is when you are trying to explain a mechanism or a process, that is to talk about how something has been done, okay, to explain it qualitatively, sorry. And then that is the first one, is the synthesis framework, let's call it, for reporting data. And then there is another one, which is to focus on differences. And we also have four models in that one. The first one is to talk about the dominant pattern, that is to talk about common processes or different processes, okay? So you talk about, you group groups differently, and you talk about the common things within that group and the differences between or among different groups in your data. The second one is the animated model, which is to explain the relationships between the different codes and the different things. So you explain how one relates to the other. The next one is the typology. That is generally, typology one is when you are talking about the ideal language learner or the real language. Imagine we want to do the best language student for a virtual exchange, and you're going to group characteristics, positive and negative characteristics. Okay, so that will be the typology reporting model. And you can also do the zooming in, which is to challenge or to extend whatever by showing a richer picture of whatever. For example, a virtual exchange. Everybody has analyzed the benefits and the challenges of virtual exchanges. But what we're going to do is we're going to analyze whether those benefits are really benefits, or they always come with some kind of challenge, or whether students who consider that beneficial consider that a challenge. That is another way of reporting the data once we have analyzed those data. Okay, and then to finish, and I thought this was going to be shorter, but not, okay. I'm going to talk about the main problems reporting qualitative data. And I will say there are I would say three problems. The first one is what Richards calls a patchwork quilt. A quilt. Okay. So the first one is to start with long quotations. That is, you start reporting and you quote everything some students have said. So you have these really long quotations, which make you lost focus on whatever you're explaining. And they result in a really bad reduction of data. So at the end, what you get is just these disconnected ideas all over the place, but really you don't get like any general idea or any pattern emerging from those from that analysis. And that's really one problem, okay? Then the second one is what is called an illuminated description. So you are reporting everything in a very vivid, colorful description, describing all the processes, etc. This is very common in case studies. And what it does at the end is like it offers just like a description of something, but it's not an explanation of anything. And when we are doing qualitative research, what we want to do is to be able to explain something, not really to illustrate anything. Okay, so that is the second problem. And then the last problem, which is called a leap of faith by Richards also, is when you have some data, but you explain things which cannot be explained by your analysis. That is, you explain too much, or your conclusions are like really too broad, too general, and they are not supported by data. Okay, and this is also very typical of qualitative studies, in which people start telling you what they think, what they believe, whatever, but it's not supported by the data which you have. Okay, so those are the three types of things you need to avoid when you are reporting qualitative research. And that's everything. So thank you very much. And now, if you have any questions, I will be very happy to answer anything which hasn't been clear enough.
Thank you very much, Camino, for this wonderful and very informative keynote workshop. Well, the first part is more theoretical, and then we'll move on to something more applied. Does anybody have any questions, comments? Abraham has
Yes,
raised his hand.
yes, I do.
You
Hi.
have a
Hello.
question too?
Hi.
Hi,
Nice to see you. I'm sorry I was late because I had
what's your
another
name?
meeting, so I
Uh,
didn't see the beginning of your talk. But I've got two questions. One of them is if this is going to be recorded, so, because it would be really helpful for my students.
yeah, it's being recorded as we speak.
Okay, because I've got a PhD student, and
What's your
I've
name?
got.
Sorry, I didn't get your name.
Oh, I'm Soraya. Sorry, I'm Soraya.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Hello.
Nice to see
Hi.
you.
But by the way, I'm seeing Abraham raised his hand. So sorry, I didn't see he's got a question.
Okay, Soraya, I think he can
Sorry. Okay,
hear
and another question
more and
is,
then he'll ask his question. Okay.
yeah, is there, I don't know if you have mentioned it, but my student has got problems with the ethical committee. She's a doctoral PhD student. Because of the sample of the sample of the students. So what is there? I don't know if you have mentioned it, or do you recommend a specific sample to carry out this qualitative research, or you did not speak about this at all?
No, I didn't speak about the ethical considerations. I know it's a problem nowadays, but I mean, I don't know what exactly, Soraya.
Yeah,
Can
the
you?
question was, is there a required number of participants in qualitative research?
No, not really.
Okay.
Not really. It all depends, really. I mean, all depends on the questions or on the goals. At this, for example, if you want to talk about one example, this is for example, like a journal paper that was rejected. Okay, so you want to talk about the effects of the reform the government has done on university studies, for example. Okay, so imagine the government has like passed like a new law. Okay, and in that new law, they have modified what needs to be studied. And they want to see the reactions of teachers. Okay. If your study has 3 teachers, that's, sorry, I mean, 3 teachers to analyze a reform when there are 25,000 teachers is like,
Yes. Yeah.
sorry, do you
Yeah.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
But if you're going to analyze how the students in a class have reacted to being to I don't know, to being shown videos of Frank de la Jungla, let's call it, I don't know, whatever. I mean, whatever you're analyzing. And you get maybe one student who is not a very good student, one student who is a sort of like intermediate student, and one student who is very good or very proficient. You have 3 students, and that's enough because you have a sample that illustrates like all the possible population. Okay.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
so it depends. Is there a number? No, but I mean, you need to more or less consider how many people are enough to be a representative sample of the whole population.
Yeah. Yeah. Completely agree. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Soraya, for the question.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, hello. Hello, Professor Bueno. Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizer of the workshop. Thank you, Ana Sevilla. Thank you, Professor Bueno. Well, thank you for your talk. I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions. Yeah. The first one is that do you recommend any particular software for the qualitative analysis? Because I used MaxQDA last year, and that was hard at times. And the second question is, I think that you focus most of the talk on the coding, and I do agree with you that coding is very, is a very important part of qualitative analysis. And my question here is, how do you feel about using AI tools for the coding, for the grouping of the categories? How do you feel about it? Because I think it is a trend.
Yes.
Or it will be a trend in the near future.
Yes. Okay. So first thing, I don't know. I mean, I generally use Atlas T. That's the one I use. And I haven't used any other software. So I don't really know. Okay. For me, Atlas T, it works very well for what I've done. Okay. But I do not do very, very complex things. So I don't really know. I mean, you might need something more powerful. But I'm not really the best, I think, to give any advice on software, really. The only one I've used, Atlas T, and for what I do is more than enough, but I don't really know. Okay, so that depends. And then about AI, well, I don't know. How do I feel about it? Well, my my research field is new technologies. Okay, that means so I know quite a lot about artificial intelligence, and I have mixed feelings about things because I think artificial intelligence is not being used for what it is supposed to be used. Okay, so it's quite difficult to explain. I think you can use artificial intelligence to group things into categories, as long as you really know what a category is, which is probably the most difficult thing to know. Okay, so what I mean is I'm not a great fan of artificial intelligence being used to group things into categories, because I don't think artificial intelligence has criteria. That is my main thing. I mean, artificial intelligence basically does give you what other people have done. I mean, artificial intelligence is not human intelligence in the sense that he knows, or it knows what human behavior is about. So, saying that, it can be used to create sort of initial categories. Okay, so I'm going to see how artificial intelligence groups all this variety of things, and is going to do it quickly. So for that, I think it is useful in the sense of economy. Okay? Economy, to have an initial grouping of categories. But I am very worried about the fact that some people do not analyze that grouping. That is, they just get the grouping and they say, oh, this is fine. That's it. I'm going to analyze all the data with what artificial intelligence has given. Even worse, some people do not analyze the data anymore. The artificial intelligence is analyzing, is grouping the data, is analyzing the data, is doing everything. So at the end, I have no idea how those people report on what they have found out, because you haven't found out anything. It's like artificial intelligence has found out things. So, I mean, if you're going to use it just to have an initial grouping of all the themes, so that group all these into different categories, and then once you get that, you analyze whether that has been done in the way that you think should be done, I think it is fine because it saves time. But what I said, I'm not going to repeat myself. I don't know if that's...
Yeah, that's absolutely fine, because I see eye to eye with you on this. But yeah, it's going to be a trend in the next few years, or I might say months. Yeah. Yeah, you can have all that, and I do support what you said, and just it needs to be reviewed by the researchers and go through a thorough, let's say, revision when you're analyzing data and using AI tools. Well, thank you very much for your answers.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, if nobody else has a question, I'd have a couple of things that I wrote down here as you were talking, a couple of doubts, things that I wanted to ask you about. Well, the first thing was actually, what resources would you recommend for students who want to, nowadays it's a big trend for students to follow tutorials and all kinds of self-learning resources. So what would be the path that you would design for them to do so? And also, what specific articles that you've authored would you recommend? Because as you know, in this event, we have a very high number of students registered, and they're obviously going to attend your talk, and they might be interested. If you don't have them right now, you can always let me know later, and then I will publish them in the website, or find a way to give those resources to students. And then specifically connected to your talk, I found the categories of indirect and direct data a bit hard to understand. Specifically, when you mentioned that surveys should be considered indirect data, what do you mean by that? Do you mean surveys as in questionnaires? Or because if they're questionnaires, can't you in a questionnaire just ask direct questions about what you are observing? Or would that mean that you are kind of trying to bias and influence the responses? Maybe it depends on how those questionnaires are designed, or maybe you mean something else by survey, because I know these are not exact synonyms. And then the last thing that I wrote was when you were mentioning the coding traps, I was taking notes on number 3, reduction of the data to fit the software program. And I became really curious concerning whether you've had any specific challenges or experiences, things that you had to be creative about because the software had certain limitations and you needed to do certain things, and then which creative ways did you find to to solve the challenges or to do what you wanted to do? I'm sorry if it's too many questions. You can just address whatever you want to address, and then later on during the virtual coffee break we can we can discuss the other ones.
Okay, so okay, so thank you very much for the questions. Okay, the first one, can you explain a bit further about my research, my papers? What exactly would you like me to?
Oh, I mean, I wondered if you have authored any papers that you think are particularly useful for maybe connected to the first question, because like I said, very often I get students that say, hey, I want to learn on my own as much as possible, not just through the kind of more academic path that we're offering here at the university, because I tell them, well, here's the list of references, here's this, here's that. But then it's like they want something maybe more applied, hands-on, or maybe more audiovisual. They don't like having to read as much. Nowadays, getting our students to read is a big challenge indeed. So connected to that self-teaching, self-learning path that they would follow, like self-training and lifelong training, etc. Whether you would recommend, okay, this article or this material that I've authored is particularly useful. Well, and if you don't want to recommend something that you've authored, or something by
Okay.
else.
But do you mean, Anna, do you mean about qualitative data analysis?
Yes, specifically about qualitative data analysis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I can recommend, yeah. Well, I will send you a paper I have in which we did a sort of like more sophisticated, I will call a qualitative data analysis, so that you can see it. And for that, and also this one, the book, this book
By
is,
Richard, the one you
is
mentioned.
one of the best ones you can find on handling qualitative data. Okay, this is very good, because generally when you get books on qualitative data analysis, you get a lot of books which are very theoretical. And this one is the second book by this woman. And in this one, she just explains how to analyze data. And it's not that theoretical thing about types of research, what you find with any or whatever. So this one I think is quite good for
Is
for
it
that.
along the lines of Dornia's that also has several really good and to the point?
Yeah. It's kind of like that. Yeah, this is like, it's kind of like a workshop, I will call it. Like in every chapter at the end, you have sort of things to do, like activities and things like that. So I think this is quite good for autonomous learning. This one, I like that one. So that's
Thank you so much. I'll be sure to recommend it to my students.
okay. And the article, I will write it down later in the chat so you can have that. And then regarding like your second question, surveys, I mean the questionnaires. I don't know why I'm calling it surveys, but it's the questionnaires. And what I meant about indirect data in questionnaires is because generally when we do questionnaires, or at least when I have done questionnaires, but maybe in your case it's different, it can be. Generally, I'm not asking them about, for example, their perceptions about virtual exchange. For example, in the one we are doing, the questionnaire we have, the pre-exchange questionnaire and the post questionnaire, is not really about their feelings about the virtual exchange, except one question, I think. The rest of it is how the virtual exchange has affected their socio-emotional, I don't know how to call it, characteristics or moods, or the way they, socio-emotional being, let's call it, or whatever. So we are not really asking directly about, tell me how you think the virtual learning exchange has improved your capacity to listen to others. We are not asking that. We are asking, my capacity to listen to others is, and then you say, oh, is very good. And then you have agree, disagree, whatever. And then below that, in our questionnaire, we don't have it. But generally, in other questionnaires, you have why. Or why do you think it has improved? Or how has it improved? And generally, what they say is they talk about their feelings in general. They don't talk about their feelings about whatever you've done. So I consider that indirect, because they are not really, I mean, from those feelings they are expressing about the way they have changed, they are not talking about the virtual exchange. They are talking about how they've changed. And that's why I consider that you are analyzing the virtual exchange from the point of view of how they've changed. And that is not direct, number one, in the sense that they might have changed for other reasons. That's number one. You cannot say it's because of the virtual exchange, because you haven't asked about the virtual exchange. That is what I mean. Okay. While if you're talking about write a reflection about how you have felt in the virtual exchange, they are going to talk about that only. And that I consider that direct. Do you know what I mean? Is that clear?
Is there any way to get direct data from a questionnaire?
Yeah,
by maybe question? Because if the difference is that you're not directly asking about the virtual exchange, why not ask them? Or would that mean that then the questionnaire would no longer have validity?
Well, that asking directly about the virtual exchange.
Or socio-emotional questionnaire into direct, according to what you said, would that mean in every question we would put, this virtual exchange has helped me to become a better team player? Would that be direct?
Yeah, that will be direct. Yeah. The virtual exchange has, that will be
but
direct.
We're not looking into, we're looking into that, but not by asking them. What we're looking into is their perceptions on how good a team player they are, for example. And then we do that through the questions, and then we find a way to connect it to the VE while trying to isolate other variables that might have also contributed to making them better team members, team players, cooperative members of a group.
Well, the number one is not, I mean, to have direct and indirect data does not mean that one is better than the other. In fact, I would recommend to have both kinds of data, because that allows you for triangulation. That means you can, maybe they are saying something and then they are answering something else in the indirect data collection. And then you can say, oh my God, when asked that, they are saying this, but when asked this, they are not saying that. So that is contradictory. And that is good for triangulation of data. So I am not meaning that direct data is better than indirect data. I'm just saying that there is more than one way of getting data to analyze qualitatively for the research project. It's not, I wasn't meaning that it's one is superior to the other, not at all. I mean, both are perfectly valid. You just need to be aware that they are different ways of collecting data to explain the same phenomena or the same intervention of whatever. And both of them are perfectly valid and both of them are reliable. And in fact, I would recommend to have both kinds of data.
Okay, thank you very much.
So I don't know whether has that made clearer what I meant?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay,
and
fine.
The last question was about specific examples when you think there are certain limitations concerning the software you use. In this case, you mentioned Atlas TI.
Yes, I cannot think of any specific example right now, but give me some time and I can probably write to you. Yes, but I mean,
that's probably a good thing. If you can't think of any examples, it means that the software is not that limited.
No. It's not that much. No, it's not that much that I cannot think of examples. It's because I think it's a general thing. Okay. The general thing is like, for example, like you will find out that if the description, if your code is too long, that makes things complicated. So we tend to shorten codes, number one. And that is just to fit the program.
But then in your blog, you should have the whole thing. Maybe it's like the code name is short, but then it it involves more things than
Yes, but sometimes you lose context.
description.
For example, you lose context because you cannot categorize like everything. So sometimes it's like complicated in that sense. Okay. Another thing is many times like you have different, like when you have different levels, repeating names is complicated. Like you tend to name things the same way, and they are at different levels, and that doesn't work because of the computer software. Even if it's the best thing to do, it doesn't work. So you need to rename or modify the name of something because that's not working that way. Yes, those are like two small examples of things which you do so that what you get from the program is good enough, but not because of coding reasons, really.
Okay, so if there are not any further questions, we'd like to thank Camino again for her brilliant talk. And I think we can now move on to our virtual coffee break, which means I'm going to say goodbye and stop the recording, but please don't leave the session and then we can have a more informal talk. Okay, very nice seeing you. Hope we can meet in person soon. And again, thank you so much for being here and for bringing all these wonderful insights into qualitative data analysis. Bye.
Bye.